With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the evening. This is Jonathan Sokol. I think I got that right. He is a new member and a new member to our community at large. Moved here recently from Ohio, where he was a college music professor, and he is still a composer. But we're very lucky to have him. He's been helping out with some of our field trips as well. And tonight he's going to share some of his work as well as the influence of Birdsong on a variety of composers. So Jonathan, go ahead and take it away. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. I've got quite a lot of things to share here, so I hope I don't get carried away. And if I do, let me know. And I want to leave room at the end for any questions that anyone may have. So why don't I just start by saying that the main things that I want to share tonight deal with the fact that composers and musicians have been interested and influenced by birds and birdsong for a long time. And there is a noticeable change of how that influence is implemented in music based on how technology develops. So we'll touch on that a little bit tonight. And then lastly, I think surely new methods can be discovered. And I didn't even think about it, but just now it popped into my head to have actual, live birds on stage as concert soloists or something. So maybe that's my next adventure. But why don't we go back to Vivaldi? And I'm going to be sharing the screen quite a lot tonight. Not necessarily to share music notation, because I don't want to assume any musical knowledge. And I hope I've designed this in a way that is going to be accessible to everyone. But the couple music excerpts that I am going to share are music that I think is familiar by ear, if not by name. And then we can see kind of a direct correlation between the music versus what we hear as well. So going all the way back to the Baroque and Antonio Vivaldi and the very famous Four Seasons concertos, which are a series of violin concertos. But since we are here in the throes of spring, that's a good place to start. We'll start with Vivaldi's Spring Concerto. And he proceeds, you may or may not be aware, each of these Four Season concertos with a poem of his own that he wrote. I don't speak Italian, so luckily there's an English translation. And Spring says basically this: springtime is upon us. The birds celebrate her return with festive song, and murmuring streams are softly caressed by the breezes. Thunderstorms, those heralds of spring, roar, casting their dark mantle over heaven. Then they die away to silence, and the birds take up their charming songs once more. Quite lovely of that time. So with that, I want to open up my screen here so you can see the opening page of the Spring Concerto. I like language, and this is primarily how I learned the basics of many different languages, was by being a music student and a professor of music. But I think if I ever visited these countries, all I would be able to communicate is musical terms. So maybe it doesn't really go that far. But primavera is spring. And I just want to take our attention down to this moment here around measure 15 or so. It says Canto degli Uccelli, which is Song of the Birds. So it's very specifically included and written in there in the score by Vivaldi as a reference to part of the poem that he precedes this music with. So I'll get this started. I'll follow along and scroll along with the music through the birds section. And I guess the structure or form of what we're going to hear, depending on how long we get into it, is there's this kind of refrain. It opens with a very familiar and catchy bit of music, goes away from it, comes back, goes away to something else, comes back, goes away to something else, and so on and so forth. Because remember, there were no means of rewinding or listening over again. So composers intentionally wrote a lot of repetition into their music at that time. Time for some birds. And back. Now this isn't birds, but think about what was said in the poem after the arrival of the birds. You get the murmuring of the streams. Here's our storms, right? Now, gracefully bow out there. It gets very easy to get carried away and just want to listen to everything. But there's a lot of ink on the page and it scrolls very quickly. So what I think is important to recognize here is that it's the essence of something that's being captured. Vivaldi's not going out of his way to say, well, what am I really hearing or listening to, you know, in my native Italy? What kind of birds am I hearing in springtime? It's more capturing that essence of bird song or bird communication. But it's also kind of funny because some of the musical terminology also fits into some of the ways that we might describe a bird song that we hear, especially this little symbol here. I don't have the full list of participants open in front of me, but I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand. Just knows this symbol here, the TR with the little squiggle afterwards. There we go. No, I can't see the participants from this view. But if you're raising your hand and you're thinking trill, you're correct. It's a trill. Musical element, but also something that, you know, if you look into a field guide app and you would say perhaps, well, what do the bird songs sound like? Trilling, warbling, whistling, rising, falling, those kind of gestures, right? Those things are being captured here in the late 17th, early 18th centuries. So Vivaldi takes us into this kind of programmatic, suggestive world. With that, I'm going to move on to something a little more specific, yet quite familiar. And that is our dear friend, Beethoven. think we all know Beethoven in one capacity or another. But I want to focus on what is the second movement of his sixth symphony, the so-called pastoral symphony. And if those sets of names and terms don't mean anything put together, some of you may recognize that as the symphony that is in the original Fantasia movie with the centaurs and Pegasus and Greek mythology and all of that. That's the Beethoven symphony. So here's this wonderful little excerpt. Thank you, Wikipedia, for this image. And if you speak German, maybe these are common terms to you. But here Beethoven explicitly puts in the music score the types of birds that he's intending to imitate. We have the Nachtigall, which is Europe's, and maybe beyond, favorite bird singer, the nightingale. Long held to be the most beautiful song. Thank you, Judy. Yes, right there in the comments, nightingale. And not the first or last time we're going to hear from the nightingale today. The Wachtel is our quail, common quail. And last, the Kuckuck is the cuckoo. And we might be tempted to think of, our American equivalents, but there are some distinct differences. And I think as I was preparing all of this, I'm going to really put our test of European birds to the knowledge here. So what I want to point out is I'm going to open up a brief clip of the cuckoo so we can hear it and then kind of relate it to what Beethoven has here, and then also the quail. But I'm not going to do the nightingale because it is such a complex and varied song that I think Beethoven just took a little bit of artistic license with it here. Let's start with our dear friend, the quail. It's that dotted rhythm call, ta-ta-da, ta-ta-da. That's what Beethoven's picking up here, ta-ta-da, ta-ta-da. And he gives it to the oboe in its upper register to approximate the sound of the quail in that moment. With the cuckoo, I think we all are familiar with the cuckoo sound because there are any number of clocks around the world that give us that joy. And we can go back here and see the falling two-note gesture, call, song, whatever you want to label it, in the clarinets, that kind of very pure sound, hollow sound. The flute, and by extension, the piccolo, generally get the bulk of bird song whenever it's used in an instrumental context, simply because when we think of whistling, singing of birds, the flute and the piccolo really approximate that well. So I'm going to start Beethoven, and we're going to hear those three birds have a moment together. That's the moment that actually wraps up the entirety of that movement. And there's somewhat of a springtime element as well, because that entire movement is called Seen by the Brook, which kind of coincides with the murmuring of the stream from the Vivaldi we just listened to. Though Beethoven's intention here, I think, in the symphony as a whole, is a more generalized picture of the natural surroundings that he was used to taking part in and being a part of. So it goes beyond just any specific season. It's more encompassing of nature as a whole, which was very, very important to Beethoven. Does anyone have any questions at this point before I skip a few decades?
Well, I have a comment, Jonathan, and that's
Please.
I've been hearing, Vivaldi's Springtime Concerto all my life, but hearing you mention about the birds gave me a whole new idea to that piece. I could definitely hear them now and see what he was going for with capturing the essence of their songs.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And by the extension of that, Parker, I would encourage you to listen to the other three concerti, because they are as descriptive in their own right for those particular seasons. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to stop sharing just so I can read something and not, have it displayed in front of you, but then we'll go back to sharing and it'll be just fine. I'm jumping ahead to the early 20th century to a composer named Ottorino Respighi, also from Italy. And I guess there's another Fantasia reference there for the movie Fantasia 2000. They use Respighi's Pines of Rome. You might remember that from the flying whales and all of that. But it's actually historically quite significant, because Respighi, in the third movement from Pines of Rome, requests that a phonograph recording of a nightingale be played at the end. And not only is this significant because it was the first time a composer used a recording of Birdsong in music. Let me read this to you, because I think this is just fascinating. Again, it's from Wikipedia, but I think the information is correct no matter where it comes from in this case. In the original score, Respighi calls for a specific gramophone record to be played. Il canto del usignolo. Correct me if I'm wrong, any Italian speakers. The Song of the Nightingale. Number 2, from very specifically disc number R6105, the Italian pressing of the disc released across Europe by the Gramophone Record label between 1911 and 13. The original pressing was released in Germany in 1910 and was recorded by Karl Reich and Franz Hampe. It is the first ever commercial recording of a live bird, and Respighi used it in his piece. So I think that's just interesting to note, because perhaps in 2022, we might take something like this for granted, especially with resources like Cornell Labs Macaulay Library, with a vast array of available bird songs for use in many different contexts. That wasn't always the case. There were rumors that Respighi went out and recorded the bird himself, but that's just not the case. So with that in mind, let's go back and hear how Respighi incorporates this. We're going to hear a little bit earlier, just because I think this movement in particular is just so, what's the word? Sumptuous, svelte. It's just cinematic in all the right ways. Like composers for early animated Disney studios, I don't think would be anywhere without Respighi. So I'll let you be the judge of that. It's just my own personal take on it. Could you hear that? I pressed play for a second, but I wasn't sharing the screen. Was it audible?
Yeah, I think we could hear it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we could hear it.
Well, then thank you. I'll continue that way. So I'll pause it there because it gets very quiet and mysterious, but I think we can hear that the Respighi nightingale is quite different than the Beethoven nightingale in this way. I see in the comments, Judy says she can't hear much now. And I wonder if that's just because it tapered off. But I'll share the screen again so that it's more prominent in the future excerpts. Let's see. Incidentally, the recording I played also includes another piece by Respighi called The Birds, Gli Uccelli. And it's not as, again, it's not to transcribe exactly what birds may sound like or what their calls might be translated into music, more the impression of or the inspiration by, which is kind of in line with what we're about to hear. The opening to the second movement or second suite of Ravel's ballet, Daphnis and Chloe. And the ballet and its story and narrative really have nothing to do with birds, but the opening sunrise scene gives the impression of what we might consider the dawn chorus, the gathering of bird songs as daybreak arrives. And I think Ravel paints the bird pictures in a really interesting way musically that had not been done prior to his time. So what we're going to hear are flutes, piccolos, and then some very high string sounds that are quite different than the Vivaldi and the Beethoven that we have heard. Start around here. We've had that nice kind of high point, the first daybreak, and just for symmetry's sake, come back down. But that portion of the suite is about 5.5 minutes long and is worth your time if you haven't heard the whole thing. It's just some of the most glorious music that's ever been put on paper. But just those few snippets of bird chatter there in the orchestra right before the sun pops up from Ravel. Let's see if I can get under the screen control. My composer. We can't have a discussion about birds and music without talking about Olivier Messiaen, whose work centered on birds at one significant point in his career. And I think it's important to kind of give a little more background to Messiaen as a person and how that influenced his composing, maybe more so than some of the other composers we've talked about so far. Messiaen's primarily known for works like the Quartet for the End of Time and the Taranga Lila Symphony, and all of his many, many, many collections of birds. Catalogue d'oiseaux, les oiseaux exotiques, and many, many, many different pieces or collections. Messiaen was drafted in the Second World War, and he openly, suggested, like he wanted to be on the front lines during sunrise and sunset, particularly to hear the bird songs. So for whatever watch he was on, he kind of made it advantageous for him, or at least interesting to him. If he's gonna, be drafted or part of this thing, then he may as well enjoy the many types of birds he's hearing in the deep hours of the morning. So that's something there. In his early work, the Quartet for the End of Time, he was taken as a prisoner of war. I believe the camp was Stalag 7 or 8. They treated him pretty well, actually, and comparatively. He was able to write his Quartet for the End of Time there. It had a lot of his essence as a devout Christian put into that work, and all the 8 movements of that piece are in reference to some excerpt from the book of Revelation. But he does reference birds quite a bit in that piece too. In the opening movement, he has a song of the nightingale. He has other just kind of generic bird song. There's a movement called The Abyss of Birds. It's a more poetic and kind of darker use of influence than we've seen so far. But following the war and following other developments in his own musical thinking and practice, he comes to really get quite specific. And I think maybe it just might be best to watch him, because he just does it the best. The video quality is low. I can't apologize for it, because this is archival. He's going to be talking about the birds and the characteristics of their song, and you're going to be hearing it then played on the piano. And the woman playing the piano is his wife, Yvette Loriot, and I think it's just a magical 1 minute and 16 seconds.
Et voici le rossignol. Il éclate tout d'un coup, brusquement. La seconde strophe, ce sont des batteries sur 2 sons très célèbres. Tico, 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 tico. Ensuite, dans le grave, un timbre mêlé clavecin et gong qui fait tchou, 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 tchou. Voici le râle de genêt. C'est étrange, ce rythme iambique, brève, longue, que l'on entend dans les hautes herbes de la prairie. C'est lui, il fait... Et puis, des notes répétées qui se terminent par un torculus victorieux. Tio, 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 la barix. Et enfin, des sons lents, lunaire, lointain, on croirait que ça vient d'une autre planète et que l'oiseau est parti bien bien loin ailleurs, et puis tout d'un coup il est là et il y a une phrase formidable et très rapide pour finir, et très forte. Et voici le rossignol.
Excuse me. Yeah, so there's a joy in learning not only French for the sake of understanding, but then all the French names for the European bird species, which I'm going to show another video in a second, but it doesn't include Messiaen himself. So I think this is just like a fascinating 70 some seconds of footage here. There used to be a second video and I wasn't able to find it, but that chemistry between him and his wife, and then the collaboration between his interpretation of Birdsong, then into piano. There's an article I remember reading called "Why Do Messiaen's Birds Still Sound Like Messiaen?" He's not going out of his way to transcribe it so it sounds like the bird. He's still using his own, I guess you could call it contemporary language. We're talking about mid-century, mid-20th century France. So it's a bit grittier and complicated and a sharper sound than definitely Vivaldi or Beethoven. Not music that I think a general public would put on for relaxation, but there's a certain character and sophistication to it as well. I'm gonna jump over to this other Messiaen video. We'll listen to the first 3 minutes because in his massive piano collection, the Catalogue d'Oiseaux, the Catalogue of Birds, he precedes each movement's its own separate bird, and he precedes it with a very lengthy description of his interpretation of the song. And in this video, we get to hear all the birds from the second book in their actual song, then with the actual piano transcription played. I think it's, again, very fascinating to see the two paired up with each other. Those are the audio examples, and then here you can see the preface to l'Oriole, the Oriole, golden Oriole, or however you want to call it. So I think you can hear that there's more of a inspiration in the capture of gesture and shape and contour, because some of these songs in Messiaen's language sound pretty harsh if we're speaking musically. There's a lot of dissonance, there's a lot of angular types of sonorities, but the general shape and maybe some of the rhythms remain present. But that's because Messiaen had devised his own musical language, and he didn't change that just to try to capture a literal translation or transcription of Birdsong. So I think it's pretty fascinating. And I'm sure many of you recognize plenty of those birds, but maybe not by their French names. So there's a little linguistics in there for us today too. Le Mer Noir. And I think Le Mer Noir was his first like solo bird piece. It's a piece for piano and flute that he must have come back to for a completely piano version, but so it is. Who's next? Whoa, sorry, the screen sharing dock comes down if I go up too high. There we go. Oh, we're going to jump into Estonia. Aino Juhani Rautavaara is not a name I think many come across, but he was quite prolific, and this is one of his gemstones of music, the Cantus Arcticus, the Concerto for Birds and Orchestra. And I distinctly remember my first time listening to this piece. I had to pull my car off the side of the road and just stop and listen, because what is this thing I'm hearing? I forwarded to the third of three movements where, does he call it migration? Swans migrating. So this is another instance of including pre-recorded bird material, and we're going to hear the sound. I don't know what swans, I'm sorry, offhand. If you recognize it, add it in the chat. I have had the great experience. I remember it must have been 2 or 3 winters ago. My then toddler was having a very difficult time going to sleep, and I found myself kind of just looking out the window or even stepping outside. It must have been almost midnight, and it was chilly, it was overcast, and the moon was out, but you could only see it really trying to come through the clouds, and then swans migrating. And it was just one of the most beautiful experiences to hear that sound in the middle of the night. So I guess double fondness for this piece. The whole movement builds to this very majestic moment, but we'll start it off and get a feel for how we can hear the swans, and then how the woodwinds of the orchestra come in with their own type of, not imitation of swan, just bird-like noodling, I guess we can call it. And then maybe I'll skip to the end so you can hear this kind of glorious cinematic moment that the orchestra reaches. Very high string instruments, quietly tremolo. Before we get some flutes and clarinets involved. So it might sound messy, complex, there's a lot going on, but Rautavaara grounds this when he starts bringing the brass instruments in. And I'm gonna jump to about here. I'm sorry for the sudden shift of texture. so on and so forth. I'm trying to be sensitive of the time. I know we're kind of coming close to a point here. Let's see. Thank you, Judy. I appreciate your comments. Who's this? Oh, right. Okay, so I did have that. The last composer I had in mind to discuss briefly is an American composer named John Luther Adams, who's not to be confused with John Coolidge Adams, who I think is the more popular John Adams if we're looking in this very kind of niche way. John Coolidge Adams is a kind of Californian personality, and I have to be honest with you, this is a little off topic, but the first time I drove out here to Stead on 395 North and saw the sign for Hallelujah Junction, my heart skipped, because John Adams has a piece called Hallelujah Junction, and I want to know everything about it. But John Luther Adams, on the other hand, primarily spent a lot of his life in Alaska and Mexico, and he has a totally different aesthetic for music, which is very nature encompassing. It's very broad, very slow changing type of music. The first time I met him, he was explaining how he has music for like this art installation where if you picture, watching the sun go across the sky, if you stare at it for 30 minutes, you might not notice much of a change, but if you leave and come back after 5 or 6 hours, then you'll notice that it has perhaps moved position, or perceived to have moved position. And that's kind of representative of a lot of his music. But here we have an earlier piece, the Songbird Song, which spans many years and has, I think, a few iterations. And I'm just going to play Morning Dove, because this was the first time I heard a composer really attempt to literally transcribe a bird song into music using the available acoustic instruments that we have. They are ocarinas in this case, with marimba background. I think I wouldn't be too wrong in assuming that most of us know the Morning Dove Call, but it's very similar to that if you haven't heard it. And even looking ahead, I mean, if we take out the wood thrush, and I can't remember what other birds he uses. I think there might be meadowlark in here with the meadow dance. It's been a while since I've seen the music to this, but the Morning Dove to me is the most convincing. The wood thrush it's very difficult to capture that song with acoustic instruments. So can Parker or Jenny or Diane kind of give me a cue as to where we are in time wise?
It is 7:53, so if folks have questions, they can put them in the Q&A, and we can start going through them if you're ready for that.
Sure. I mean, I could go on for another hour, but, just to make sure I'm not, keeping anyone or getting behind on any schedule. I see Alan's comment here or question that Mozart had a pet starling, and did that starling have any influence on Mozart's music? I also heard that he had a pet starling. I don't know if there's any direct influence on his music, but my memory is like chiming in the back of my head that there is something. So Alan, I might have to get back to you on that, because off the top of my head, I don't know that there's a direct answer available in this moment. But thank you for asking that, because it's a good reminder that I had a relatively recent conversation about this somewhere. Magic Flute has a bird guy. That's right. Is it Papageno or Tamino? Which one is it? Colleen's comment about John Luther Adams' Become Ocean, Become Desert are just fabulous pieces, really extraordinary pieces to just sit down for 45 minutes or something and get washed over with sound. It's just really, I think, unique perspective and aesthetic in music making.
I have a comment, Jonathan. If you had just sent me that, played that ocarina piece of the Mourning Dove without the marimba backgrounds, I probably would have thought that that was an actual recording of a mourning dove.
It's really convincing, isn't it?
Very much.
The first time I heard it too, I thought so as well. I've attempted to put Birdsong into some of my music as well, in terms of, you know, using flutes and imitating rhythm and trying to actually get precise pitch and rhythm. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I've been inspired and have incorporated gesture and movement. And then in the piece that I had set aside, if there was enough time, is a piece where I incorporated, similar to what we've seen before. I made pre-recorded tracks of different birds singing. So essentially just combined clips of bird song into one large track that played alongside the orchestra as the piece went along, to signify things like the dawn chorus or spring migration or something like that. Yeah, Colleen, that's right. Mozart's Starling. I have to find that book. You're welcome to all of you in the comments. This was a lot of fun, and it's a pleasure and honor to share something that I think I take for granted sometimes, with especially a new community and an audience who is openly receptive. As I was talking to Jenny before we started, you know, my typical recipients of this subject were college students who I think I had a good mixture of interest in, like, well, you know, this is a class I need to take to pass, you know, whatever. So it's really quite an honor to be able to share this with all of you. Any other comments or questions?
Looks like just a lot of gratitude.
Diane, I think I remember
in.
we talked about that. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Jenny, you were saying.
Respond to that.
Oh, I was just saying Diane's comment. When we were doing the field trip leader orientation, I think we had a brief conversation about this, and it's a task to notate birdsong. You know, if we're talking strictly musically, but it doesn't have to be. And I think you saw with the Messiaen that it looks like music, but there are elements of traditional music that are removed. And certainly by 2022, we should be able to write whatever makes sense to us.
Yes, I would say that music notation helped me a lot when I was learning birdsong, because it helped me a little bit to figure out if there was a long note, if there was a staccato note, or if there was a trill, if there was a slide. And I could write that down in my notebook, and it would help me remember the song.
Yeah, truly. Certainly the ways I remember my Eastern warbler songs are very musically notated. Black-throated green with that kind of sound, and that beer of the black-throated blue. And I don't hardly know many of the Western warbler songs, but I'll keep my ears open. other than the yellow warbler I heard recently. That's a very familiar call to me. Students from the drawing class would like to know who painted that picture. I don't know. Are we talking about this one that's still on the screen? Let's see.
Yeah.
Let's see. Usually there is some kind of attribution here, but it doesn't look like that's the case with this. I don't know if this is the cover art for the record release, in which case I can look that up and share it and we can get that information to you. I don't think this looks a little bit more exotic than you know, an American species, unless it's a evening grosbeak, but that could be a stretch. I don't know. Jenny, I'm sorry, you've been holding on to your thought this whole time.
No, I was just saying that there's a lot of gratitude coming in on the comments, and I wanted to echo it as well. Your passion for birds as well as music is very apparent, and even though we are digitally apart, it was very engaging and a really interesting presentation. So thank you so much for sharing that with us tonight.
Thank you
really
for having me.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel probably next week. So if there's any parts that people want to go back and review, it'll be there and available. But thank you so much. Any parting thoughts, Jonathan?
Let's go out in the field and do some listening. See what we hear.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining. Hope to see you at Spring Wings this weekend or one of our other upcoming events. Thanks everybody. Have a good night.